The map is creased along the fold lines, the paper soft and yellowish from decades of handling. It's tucked into the glove box of a dusty sedan that hums along a two-lane road cutting through cornfields and small towns that seem to have been forgotten by time itself. The driver, a man named Harold, is headed west. He left his home in Delaware early that morning. He doesn't have a destination in mind, only a direction. He's following a road that used to be a highway. It used to be something enormous, something that carried the dreams of a nation. But now it's just blacktop that snakes through sleepy villages where the main street has a diner, a hardware store, and a post office. The gas stations are few and far between. Harold doesn't mind. He's not in a hurry. He's chasing the ghost of a road that once rivaled the most famous highway in America. Most people have heard of Route 66. It is the Mother Road, the main street of America, the ribbon of concrete that carried Dust Bowl refugees to California and post-war families to the neon lights of the West. It has been sung about in songs, written about in novels, and traveled by millions. But there is another road. A road that was longer, older, and in many ways just as important. A road that was supposed to be the great transcontinental highway. It was called the National Road, later known as US Route 40. And for a while, it was the only way to get from the East Coast to the West Coast on decent pavement. It rivaled Route 66 in traffic, in commerce, in the sheer volume of stories that unfolded along its path. But then the interstate system came, and the travelers moved to faster, straighter roads. Route 40 was left behind. It became a forgotten highway. To understand why Route 40 mattered, you have to go back to the early days of the automobile. In the 1910s and 20s, there were no numbered highways. Travelers followed a patchwork of local roads, often dirt, often impassable in bad weather. The federal government had built the National Road in the early 1800s, but that only went from Cumberland, Maryland, to Vandalia, Illinois. It was a wagon road, not a car road. Then came the Good Roads movement, and groups of businessmen began to map out transcontinental routes. One of the earliest was the Lincoln Highway, which ran from New York to San Francisco, but it was a northern route, prone to snow. Another was the old Spanish Trail in the south. And then there was the Victory Highway, established after World War I to honor the soldiers who had fought. The Victory Highway followed a path from New York City to San Francisco, cutting through the middle of the country. When the federal government created the U.S. highway system in 1926, the Victory Highway became U.S. Route 40, and that is when it truly began to rival Route 66. Route 40 started in Atlantic City, New Jersey on the boardwalk, and ended in San Francisco, California at the Pacific Ocean. It was over 3,000 miles long. Route 66 was about 2,400 miles. Route 40 was the longer road, the more direct line from ocean to ocean. It passed through the heart of the Midwest, over the Rocky Mountains, and across the deserts of Nevada and Utah. For a traveler in the 1930s, the choice between Route 40 and Route 66 was a real one. Route 66 went through the desert southwest, past the Painted Desert and the Petrified Forest. Route 40 went through the plains, over the Great Divide, and down into the Great Basin. Each had its own kind of beauty. Each had its own kind of trouble. The road that Harold is driving on now was once part of that great highway. He is in Ohio, passing through a town called Cambridge. There is a brick Main Street, a courthouse square, and a faded mural on the side of a building advertising a hotel that closed 50 years ago. He stops for gas at a station that looks like it has not been updated since the 1950s. The owner is an old man named Earl, who remembers when Route 40 was the busiest road in the state. He tells Harold about the traffic jams that used to happen here on summer weekends, cars lined up for miles, all heading west. There were motels every mile, diners every half mile. You could get a hamburger and a milkshake, a room with a bed and a bathroom for a few dollars. Earl worked at the station when he was a teenager, pumping gas, wiping windshields, giving directions. He saw people from every state, from every walk of life. Families in station wagons, truck drivers hauling produce, salesmen in suits, couples on their honeymoon. It was a river of metal and glass flowing past his front door. And then one day it stopped. The interstate came, Interstate 70 to be precise. It paralleled Route 40 for much of its length, but it was faster and safer. Travelers could drive 70 miles per hour without stopping for traffic lights. They could bypass every town. The motels and diners along Route 40 began to close. The stations became shuttered. The road itself became a local road, a back road, a forgotten road. But it was not always that way. There was a time when Route 40 was the road that everyone talked about, the road that everyone wanted to drive. In the 1920s, before Route 66 was even a number, the National Road was already a legend. It was the road that carried the first automobiles across the Appalachians, the road that opened the Midwest to commerce. In the 1930s, it was the road that Dust Bowl refugees took to California. Yes, many took Route 66, but many others took Route 40 through Colorado and Utah. They came from the Great Plains, from Kansas and Nebraska, looking for work. They came in trucks packed with everything they owned. They came with nothing. The road was their lifeline. One of the most famous stories of Route 40 is the story of the Donner Party, but that was a wagon train, not a car trip. No, the stories that matter are the small ones. The mechanic who fixed a broken radiator under a shade tree. The farmer who gave a family a ride into town. The waitress who served coffee and pie to a tired truck driver. The motel owner who let a stranded traveler stay for free. These are the moments that built the legend of the road. And then there was the beauty of the road itself. Route 40 crossed the Ohio River at Wheeling, West Virginia, on a suspension bridge that was a marvel of engineering. It went through the rolling hills of Pennsylvania, the flat farmland of Indiana, the cornfields of Illinois. In Missouri, it followed the Missouri River for a stretch. In Kansas, it cut through the wheat fields. In Colorado, it climbed into the Rocky Mountains, crossing the Continental Divide at a pass called Berthoud Pass. That was a terrifying drive in the winter, with snow and ice and switchbacks that seemed to go forever. But the view from the top was worth it. You could see the whole world spread out below you, the mountains stretching to the horizon, the air thin and cold and clean. After the Rockies, the road descended into the high desert of Utah and Nevada. It went through Salt Lake City, past the Great Salt Lake, and then across the Bonneville Salt Flats, where race cars set speed records on the hard white surface. Then into the alkali flats of Nevada, a landscape so empty and harsh that it seemed like another planet. The road was straight for miles, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the emptiness. There were towns out there, but they were few and far between. Wendover, Nevada, on the Utah border. Elko, Nevada, a railroad town. Winnemucca, where the cowboys came to town on weekends. And then Reno, the biggest little city in the world, with its neon lights and casinos and divorce mills. By the time you reached the Sierra Nevada, you were almost to California. The road climbed over Donner Pass, named for the ill-fated Donner Party, and then dropped down into the Sacramento Valley. From there, it was a straight shot to San Francisco, over the Bay Bridge and into the city by the bay, the end of the road. But Harold is not going that far. He's just driving for the sake of driving, following the old concrete, listening to the radio stations that fade in and out. He passes through towns that have faded too. Zanesville, Ohio, where the Y-shaped bridge is still a landmark. Columbus, the state capital, but he sticks to the old road, the one that goes through the suburbs and small towns, not the big highway. He sees a motel that still has its neon sign, but the letters are broken. It reads Vacancy Y. He imagines the families that stayed there, the kids splashing in the pool, the parents sitting on the porch chairs, drinking coffee and smoking cigarettes, planning the next day's drive. The road is quiet now. There are not many cars. A pickup truck here and there, a farmer's truck hauling hay, a school bus, a mail truck. The pace is slow. The speed limit is 45 miles per hour. Harold drives with his elbow out the window, the wind blowing his hair. He feels like he is driving through time itself. He thinks about the people who built this road, the surveyors and the engineers and the laborers. He thinks about the politicians who argued over its route, the businessmen who lobbied for it to pass through their towns. He thinks about the generation of Americans who grew up on this road, who learned to drive on it, who fell in love on it, who left home on it. It was a road of departures and arrivals, of goodbyes and hellos. And he thinks about how strange it is that a road so important could be so completely forgotten. Route 66 is preserved in memory, in roadside museums and gift shops and documentaries, but Route 40 is just a road. You can drive it and never know you are on an historic highway. The markers are gone, the signs are faded, the motels are boarded up, the diners are closed. The only evidence that this was once a great American road is the occasional row of gas stations that have been converted into storage units, or the remains of a neon sign that once blazed in the night. Harold pulls over at a scenic overlook. He gets out of the car and stands at the edge, looking down into a valley. There is a river below, winding through the trees. He can see the interstate in the distance, a line of moving lights. He looks at his map, the old one, and he traces the route with his finger. He is following the ghost of a highway. He knows that he is one of the few people who still do, and yet the road is still there. It is still waiting. It is still calling out to anyone who will listen. The forgotten highway that once rivaled Route 66 is not dead. It is just asleep. And on a quiet afternoon, when the sun is low and the traffic is light, you can still hear its voice, whispering through the cracks in the pavement. You can still feel its pull, that old American urge to head west, to see what is over the next hill, to follow the road as far as it will go. Harold gets back in his car. He turns the key. The engine catches. He pulls back onto the road, heading west. He doesn't know where he will stop for the night. He doesn't care. The road will tell him. The road always tells you. It tells you where to go, when to stop, and what to remember. And as he drives into the fading light, he knows that this forgotten highway has not forgotten him. It is still a road of stories, and he is just beginning to hear them. He drove on, and the sun began to sink behind the hills of western Ohio, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The old road, this forgotten highway, seemed to glow in the golden light. Harold rolled down his window and let the warm air rush in, carrying the smell of cut hay and wildflowers. He passed a farmhouse with a porch swing, and for a moment he could almost see the ghosts of the past, a family sitting there on a summer evening, waving at the travelers going by. He wondered how many thousands of waves had been exchanged along this road, how many friendly gestures had crossed the divide between those who stayed and those who moved on. He came to a small town called Cambridge. It was one of those places that had once been a bustling stop on the national road, a place where the caravans of pioneers had paused to rest and resupply. Now it was quiet, almost sleepy. The main street had a few antique shops and a diner that looked like it had been frozen in time. Harold pulled over and went inside. The diner was called the Good Eats Cafe, and it had a counter with red vinyl stools, a jukebox in the corner, and the smell of coffee and bacon that seemed to have soaked into the walls over decades. He sat down at the counter, and a waitress named Dottie came over. She was in her 70s, with gray hair pulled back in a bun and a smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "What can I get you, hun?" she asked. "Coffee and a slice of pie if you have any," Harold said. "We always have pie." "Apple, cherry, pecan. The apple's fresh this morning." "Apple it is." While Dottie poured his coffee, Harold looked around the diner. There were only a few other customers, an old man reading a newspaper, a couple of truck drivers eating burgers. The walls were covered with photographs of the road in its heyday. Black and white pictures of cars parked outside the diner, of families posing with the big neon sign that once said Good Eats Cafe, of the old bridge over the river. Harold pointed to one of the photos. "Was that taken here?" Dottie set down the pie plate and leaned over to look. "That's my daddy's truck. He used to haul cattle along the national road. That was 1952. I was just a little girl. I remember standing right there on the sidewalk, waving to the drivers. You've been here that long, born and raised in this town. My family owned this diner since 1934. My grandmother started it. She made pies from scratch every morning, just like I do. The road was our lifeblood, you know. Every day, cars and trucks and buses would pull up. We had a gas station next door, but that's closed now. The interstate killed it." Harold nodded. He took a bite of the pie. It was good, sweet, and tart with a flaky crust. "This is the best pie I've had in years." "Thank you, hun. That's the same recipe my grandmother used. She said you can't rush a pie and you can't rush a road trip either." Harold smiled. She was right. He ate his pie slowly, savoring each bite. Dottie refilled his coffee and stood by the counter, wiping it with a rag. She seemed to want to talk. Maybe it was because she didn't get many customers anymore, or maybe she sensed that Harold was a kindred spirit, someone who understood what the road meant. "You know," she said, "I remember when Route 40 was the king of the roads. We would get travelers from all over. Some were coming from the East Coast, heading to California. Others were going the other way, heading to New York, but they all stopped here. I remember one summer in the late 50s, a family pulled up in a station wagon. They had 4 kids and a dog. The kids were all sticky and tired from the heat. My grandmother gave them free lemonade. The dad was a salesman. He sold encyclopedias door to door. He said he drove the whole length of the national road twice a year. He knew every diner, every motel, every mechanic between here and Pennsylvania. He said the road was like a living thing with its own rhythms and moods. "What happened to him?" Harold asked. "I don't know. Maybe he retired, maybe he passed. But I like to think he's still out there on some quiet stretch of road, driving with his elbow out the window, listening to the radio." Harold finished his pie and paid the bill. He left a generous tip. Dottie thanked him and said, "You take care, hun. Give my regards to the road." He promised he would. Outside, the sky was turning purple. The first stars were appearing. He got back in the car and drove on, through the town and out into the countryside. The road stretched ahead, a dark ribbon in the twilight. He thought about what Dottie had said about the road being a living thing. It was true. The road had a memory. It held the echoes of all the footsteps, all the tires, all the conversations that had passed over its surface. He drove for another hour, passing through small towns with names like Norwich and New Concord. Each one had a story, a piece of the larger narrative. In New Concord, he saw a historical marker about the national road. He pulled over to read it. The marker said that this town was the birthplace of John Glenn, the astronaut. He had grown up here on this very road. Harold imagined young John Glenn looking up at the stars, dreaming of space while the cars and trucks rolled by, carrying people to the next town, the next state, the next adventure. It was a reminder that the road was not just about the past. It was also about the future. It was a path that led to dreams. He drove on through the night until he reached the Ohio River. The bridge at Wheeling was still there, the old suspension bridge that had been a marvel of engineering when it was built in 1849. He crossed it slowly, the metal grating humming under his tires. The river was dark and wide, reflecting the lights of the city. He thought about all the people who had crossed this bridge before him, settlers heading west, soldiers returning from war, families fleeing the Dust Bowl, tourists on vacation. They had all passed this way, and now he was adding his own journey to the long river of history. On the other side of the bridge, the road continued into West Virginia, but only for a few miles before it turned back into Pennsylvania. The road here was narrower, older, the pavement cracked and patched. It wound through the hills, following the contours of the land. Harold had to slow down for the curves. He didn't mind. He was in no hurry. He wanted to feel the road, to experience it the way travelers did in the days before interstates, when every mile was an event. He came to a town called Washington, Pennsylvania. It was a quaint place with brick buildings and a courthouse square. He found a motel that looked like it had been preserved from the 1950s. The sign said the Colonial Motor Lodge, and the neon was still working, glowing blue and red in the darkness. He checked in. The room was clean and simple, with a tube television and a picture of a covered bridge on the wall. He lay on the bed and listened to the sounds of the night, a dog barking somewhere, the hum of a distant truck on the interstate, the creak of the old building settling. He thought about the millions of people who had slept in rooms like this, strangers in a strange town on their way to somewhere else. The road was a constant. The faces changed, but the road remained. The next morning he woke early. The sun was just rising, casting long shadows across the parking lot. He had breakfast at a diner down the street, where he ordered eggs and toast and a cup of coffee that was strong enough to wake the dead. The waitress was young, probably in her 20s, and she was reading a textbook at the counter. She was studying to be a nurse. Harold asked her if she ever thought about the history of the road. "I guess I don't think about it much," she said. "It's just the road I take to work every day, but my grandmother used to tell me stories. She said that when she was a girl, the road was so busy that sometimes you couldn't even cross the street. She worked at a motel when she was a teenager, cleaning rooms. She met a movie star once. He was driving through and he stopped for the night. She said he was very nice and tipped her $5, which was a lot of money back then. Do you remember who it was? She said it was James Dean, but that was before he was famous. He was just a young actor on his way to a screen test in Hollywood. She said he was shy and polite, and he ate a sandwich in the diner and talked about his dreams. She always felt like she had met him before he became a legend." Harold smiled. The road was full of such moments, chance encounters that became stories passed down through generations. He finished his breakfast and left a tip. Then he was back on the road, heading east now into the rising sun. The road climbed into the Appalachian foothills. The leaves were turning, and the trees were a patchwork of red and gold and orange. It was beautiful. He passed through towns that seemed to be clinging to the mountainsides, their main streets lined with old brick buildings. In a town called Uniontown, he saw a gas station that still had a sign advertising free air and Pennzoil. It looked abandoned, but the pumps were still there, silent witnesses to a bygone era. He stopped to take a picture. As he was standing there, an old man came out of a nearby house. He was wearing overalls and a straw hat. He walked over to Harold. "You taking pictures of the old station?" he asked. "Yes, sir. It's a beautiful piece of history. That was my daddy's station. He ran it from 1935 until 1975. I helped him when I was a boy. I remember the day the interstate opened. Daddy sat right here on this curb and watched the cars go by on the new road. He said, 'Well, son, that's the end of that.' And he was right. Business dropped off to nothing. He sold the station a few years later. It's been empty ever since." Harold listened. The old man pointed to a faded sign on the wall. "You see that? That's the sign for Route 40. We used to have a big sign out front, but it fell down in a storm. Nobody cared enough to put it back." "Why do you think Route 40 was forgotten?" Harold asked. The old man scratched his chin. "Because it wasn't glamorous enough, I guess. Route 66 had the song, the TV show, the neon. It was the road of the American dream, but Route 40 was the workhorse. It was the road of commerce, of farmers and truckers and families just trying to get by. It didn't have the romance, but it had the real story. It was the road that built America." Harold thanked the old man and drove on. The word stayed with him, the road that built America. He thought about all the goods that had traveled along this highway: wheat from Kansas, lumber from the Pacific Northwest, oil from Texas. He thought about the people who had moved along its length, the immigrants and the refugees and the seekers. The road was the backbone of the nation, the invisible line that connected the East and the West. He drove through the mountains, past farms and forests, past small churches and old graveyards. The road rose and fell, following the natural contours of the land. He passed a covered bridge that was still in use, a relic from the 19th century. He crossed it slowly, the wooden planks rattling under his tires. There was a sign that said "Bridge built 1832." It had been standing for nearly 200 years. It had seen the passage of horses and wagons, then cars and trucks. It had seen war and peace boom and bust, and it was still there, sturdy and strong. In the early afternoon, he reached the top of a hill and saw a sign, "Entering Bedford County." He pulled over at a scenic overlook. Below him stretched a valley, green and peaceful. The interstate was visible in the distance, a concrete ribbon carrying traffic at high speed. But here, on the old road, everything was quiet. He got out of the car and sat on a wooden bench. He took out his map and traced the route ahead. He would be in Maryland by evening, and then into Pennsylvania again, and then into Ohio once more. The road was a loop, a circle that kept coming back to itself. He felt like he could drive forever, following the ghost of the highway. As he sat there, he heard a sound, a low rumble that grew louder. He looked up and saw a convoy of classic cars coming around the bend. There were about a dozen of them, all from the 1950s and 1960s, a Chevrolet Bel Air, a Ford Thunderbird, a Studebaker, a Cadillac. They were driving slowly, their chrome gleaming in the sunlight. They passed by and the drivers waved. Harold waved back. It was like a parade, a celebration of the road. He realized that he was not the only one who remembered. There were others who still loved this highway, who still drove it for the sheer joy of it. The road was not dead. It was just sleeping, waiting for the right travelers to wake it up. He got back in the car and followed the convoy for a while, keeping a respectful distance. They led him into a small town called Breezewood. It was a strange place, a crossroads of the old road and the interstate. The town was famous for its giant neon signs, which had been there for decades. He saw a sign that said "Gateway to the Pennsylvania Turnpike." He remembered that Breezewood was the only place where Route 40 and the Pennsylvania Turnpike intersected. It was a bottleneck, a place where travelers had to stop and make a decision. He pulled into a gas station and refueled. The attendant was a young man with a ponytail and a tattoo of a Route 66 sign on his arm. "Cool tattoo," Harold said. "Thanks, I'm a road buff. I've driven Route 66 twice, but I've always wanted to do Route 40. It's harder to find the route now. The signs are gone in a lot of places." "I'm doing it right now," Harold said. "No kidding, that's awesome. Any tips?" Harold thought for a moment. "Take your time, don't follow the GPS. Use the old maps and talk to the people you meet. They'll tell you the stories." The young man nodded. "I'll do that. Maybe one day I'll make the run." "You should," Harold said. "The road is waiting." Harold paid and drove on. The sun was beginning to descend again, the second day of his journey drawing to a close. He crossed into Maryland and the road became narrower, winding through the Catoctin Mountains. The forest was dense, the trees arching overhead. He passed through a town called Hagerstown, but he stuck to the old alignment, which was now a local road called National Pike. He saw a historic marker that told him he was on the original path of the National Road, the first federally funded highway in the United States. He felt a shiver of awe. He was driving on the same road that had been built under the direction of Thomas Jefferson, the road that had opened the West. He stopped for the night in a town called Hancock, just before the Potomac River. He found a motel that was a bit rundown but had a certain charm. The owner was an older woman named Gertrude. She had inherited the motel from her parents, who had built it in 1950. She showed him to his room and said, "You're the third guest we've had this month. It's been quiet since the pandemic, but we keep the lights on just in case." "Why do you keep it going?" Harold asked. "Because it's what my parents would have wanted. This motel has been a home away from home for thousands of people. I can't let it die, not as long as I'm still here." Harold thanked her. He sat on the porch of his room, watching the stars. The air was cool and clear. He could hear the sound of the river in the distance. He thought about all the people he had met in the past 2 days: Dottie, the old man at the gas station, the waitress in Pennsylvania, Gertrude. They were the keepers of the flame, the ones who remembered. The road was fading, but it was not gone. As long as there were people who cared, who told the stories, who kept the diners open and the motels lit, the forgotten highway would never truly be forgotten. He went inside and lay down. The walls were thin and he could hear the wind outside rustling the leaves. He closed his eyes and imagined the road as it once was, the headlights of cars sweeping through the night, the glow of neon signs, the laughter of families in motel rooms. He heard the voice of the road, a whisper that said, "Keep going, there is more to see." And he knew that he would. Tomorrow he would cross the Potomac and into West Virginia, then into Pennsylvania again, then into Ohio, and onward, following the ghost until the ghost became a memory, and the memory became a dream. He fell asleep with the sound of the road in his ears, the eternal hum of tires on pavement, the pulse of a nation that had been shaped by this humble highway. And in his dreams he was driving still, heading west into the setting sun, on the road that once rivaled Route 66, the road that had built America, the road that would never die. He woke with the first light, a pale blue glow seeping through the thin curtains. The motel room smelled of old wood and dust, but there was a warmth to it, a sense of history that clung to the walls. Harold lay still for a moment, listening to the quiet. Outside, a bird sang and the river murmured its ancient song. He stretched and got up, feeling the stiffness in his legs from 2 days of driving. He dressed and walked to the office to find Gertrude already brewing coffee. She handed him a cup without a word, and he sipped it gratefully. The coffee was strong and bitter, the kind of coffee that had kept truckers awake for decades. "You heading west today?" she asked. "Yes, across the Potomac and into West Virginia." She nodded. "Be careful on the old road. Some of those bridges are narrow and the pavement gets rough after the winter, but it's worth it. You'll see the mountains open up and you'll feel like you're in another century." Harold thanked her and paid for the room. He loaded his bag into the car and stood for a moment, looking at the motel. The neon sign was dark, but the letters were still visible. Gertrude's Court. It was a survivor, like so many of the places he had seen. He got into the car and drove out onto National Pike, following it toward the river. The Potomac was wide and slow, a silver ribbon in the morning light. He crossed the old bridge, a steel truss structure that groaned under his weight. The water below was clear and he could see the rocks on the bottom. On the other side, he entered West Virginia and the road immediately changed. It became narrower, the pavement cracked and patched in places. The trees grew close to the edge, their branches forming a canopy. He drove with his windows down, the air cool and damp. He passed a sign that said Historic National Road, and a few miles later he came to a small town called Paw Paw. He stopped at a diner called the Mountain View, which was perched on a hill overlooking a valley. The parking lot was empty, but a light was on inside. He went in and found a single waitress, a woman in her 60s named Marie. She was wiping down the counter and humming a tune. She looked up and smiled. "Morning, stranger." "You're up early. I've got a long way to go," Harold said. "Where you headed?" "West, following Route 40. Marie's eyes lit up. "Oh, the old national road. My granddaddy used to drive that road all the way to St. Louis. He was a trucker before they built the interstates. He said it was the best road in the country because it took you through every little town, every backwater. You saw the real America." Harold ordered eggs and toast, and while he ate, Marie told him stories about her grandfather. She talked about the diners that used to line the road, the gas stations with their hand-pumped fuel, the motels with their neon vacancy signs. She said that when she was a girl, the road was still busy, but then the interstate came through and everything changed. The traffic vanished and the towns started to die. But her grandfather never stopped driving the old road, even after he retired. He would take his old pickup truck and just go, exploring the forgotten stretches. "He used to say that the road has a memory," Marie said. "Every mile, every curve, every pothole has a story. You just have to listen." Harold finished his breakfast and paid. He thanked Marie and walked out into the morning. The sun was higher now, burning off the mist. He drove on, through the narrow valleys and over the rolling hills. He passed through a town called Berkeley Springs, where the springs had been a resort since the 18th century. He saw the old bathhouses, the Victorian hotels, the signs pointing to the mineral baths. He considered stopping, but he felt a pull to keep moving, as if the road itself was urging him forward. The road climbed into the mountains and the views opened up. He could see for miles, ridges of blue-green stretching to the horizon. He stopped at a scenic overlook and got out. The wind was strong, carrying the smell of pine and earth. He looked at the map and saw that he was approaching the border of Pennsylvania again. The old national road zigzagged across state lines, following the path of least resistance. He thought about the engineers who had built it, the laborers who had carved it out of the wilderness. They had built a road that would last for centuries, a road that would carry the hopes and dreams of a nation. He got back in the car and drove on. The road descended into a valley, and he came to a town called Uniontown. This was a place with a rich history, the hometown of a famous general, the site of a coal boom and bust. He saw the old courthouse, the brick storefronts, the faded signs for hotels that were no longer in business. He stopped at a hardware store that had been there since 1897. The owner was an old man named Earl who was stacking bags of fertilizer in the back. He welcomed Harold and showed him around the store. There were tools from 100 years ago, wooden handles worn smooth by generations of hands. There was a register from the 1920s, still in working order. Earl said he had inherited the store from his father, who had inherited it from his father. "We don't make much money anymore," Earl admitted, "but I can't let it go. This store is part of the town's soul. When it's gone, something will be lost forever." Harold bought a bottle of water and a small bag of peanuts. He asked Earl about the road. "Route 40 used to be the lifeblood of Uniontown," Earl said. "All the trucks came through here, all the travelers. We had 5 motels, 3 diners, 2 gas stations. Now we have one of each, and they're barely hanging on. The interstate killed us. But you know what? The road is still here. It's still beautiful. It's just not important anymore." "But that's okay. Beauty doesn't need importance." Harold nodded. He understood. The road was like a forgotten song, still playing in an empty hall. It didn't need an audience to be beautiful. It just needed to exist. He drove on through the afternoon into the heart of Pennsylvania. The road wound through the Laurel Highlands, past covered bridges and old stone churches. He saw a sign for a place called the House of the Seven Gables, a bed and breakfast that had been a stagecoach stop. He didn't stop, but he made a mental note, maybe on the way back if he ever came back. By late afternoon, he was approaching the Maryland line again. The road crossed and recrossed the border, a serpentine path that seemed to mock the lines on the map. He came to a town called Frostburg, perched on a ridge. The town had a university, and the streets were lined with old Victorian houses. He drove down Main Street and saw a historic marker for the National Road. He parked and got out to read it. The marker said that Frostburg was a major stop on the road, with hotels and stables for travelers. It said that the road had been built by the federal government to connect the East Coast to the Ohio River. He stood there, reading the words, and he felt a connection to the past. He imagined the stagecoaches clattering down the street, the horses snorting, the passengers weary and dusty. He imagined the inns with their roaring fires and their hearty meals. The road had been a lifeline, a thread that tied the nation together, and now it was a ghost. He walked back to his car and saw a young couple taking a selfie in front of the marker. They were laughing, their phones held high. He smiled. Even in its obscurity, the road still attracted people. It still had power. He drove on down the other side of the ridge into a valley. The sun was beginning to sink, casting long shadows. He crossed into West Virginia again, and then into Pennsylvania once more. He was making a loop, a figure eight of memory. He decided to stop for the night in a town called Washington, Pennsylvania, which was the home of the first National Road milestone. He found a motel that was part of a chain, but it was clean and comfortable. He checked in and walked to a nearby diner. The diner was called the Blue Moon, and it was busy with locals. He ordered a burger and a beer, and he listened to the conversations around him. People talked about the weather, about the high school football game, about the new Walmart that was opening. No one mentioned the road. He felt a pang of sadness. The road was invisible to them, a part of the background, but for him it was everything. He finished his meal and walked back to the motel. He sat on the bed and opened his map. He traced the route ahead, into Ohio, then into Indiana, then into Illinois. He would reach St. Louis in a few days, and then he would decide whether to continue west or turn back. But for now, he was content to be in the middle of the journey, suspended between the past and the present. He turned off the light and lay in the dark. The road called to him, a distant hum. He closed his eyes and let the sound carry him. He thought about all the people he had met, all the stories he had heard. They were the fragments of a larger story, the story of a highway that had once rivaled Route 66. It had never had the fame, the songs, the movies, but it had the depth, the grit, the truth. It was the road of the people, the road that built America. He fell asleep with that thought, and in his dreams he was driving again, the road stretching endless before him, the ghost of the highway guiding him west. The dream dissolved into morning light filtering through the cheap motel curtains. Harold woke slowly, the hum of the road still vibrating in his bones. He lay still for a moment, listening to the sounds of the motel stirring to life, a door slamming somewhere, a truck starting up in the parking lot, the distant clatter of breakfast dishes. He felt rested but also restless. The road was calling him again, and he was eager to answer. He showered and dressed, packed his bag, and checked out. The woman at the front desk was reading a romance novel, and she barely looked up when he handed over the key. He walked to the diner for breakfast, the same Blue Moon from the night before. The morning crowd was different, older, quieter. Men in work boots and flannel shirts sat at the counter, drinking coffee and reading newspapers. Harold ordered pancakes and bacon, and while he waited, he studied the map spread on the table. The route ahead was clear, west on Route 40 into Ohio, through Wheeling, then across the flatlands toward Columbus. But he knew the old road had many branches, many detours. He could take the main drag or veer off onto the forgotten spurs. The waitress brought his food, and he ate slowly, savoring the syrup and the salty crunch of bacon. He thought about the day ahead, about the miles of asphalt that lay between him and the Mississippi. He felt a quiet excitement, a low-grade thrill that had nothing to do with speed or destination. It was the pleasure of moving, of being in motion, of seeing the world unfold at 60 miles per hour. He paid and walked to the car. The morning was cool, with a hint of autumn in the air. The leaves were just beginning to turn, a few red and gold flecks among the green. He started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, following the signs for Route 40 West. The road left Washington, Pennsylvania, and quickly entered the countryside. The farms were neat and orderly, with white barns and silos standing tall against the sky. The road was 2 lanes, winding gently over the hills. He passed a sign for the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum and thought about stopping, but he kept going. He wanted to cover ground, to feel the rhythm of the road. He crossed into West Virginia for the 3rd time, the border marked only by a small sign. The landscape changed subtly. The hills became steeper, the trees more dense. He was following the old national road through the northern panhandle, a narrow strip of land that had once been a crucial corridor for westward expansion. He passed through a town called Triadelphia, which was little more than a cluster of houses and a church. He saw a sign for a place called the Grave of the Unknown Soldier and wondered who was buried there, what story lay beneath the soil. The road descended into the Ohio River Valley, and suddenly he saw the river itself, broad and brown, glinting in the morning light. He crossed the bridge into Wheeling, West Virginia, a city that had once been a thriving industrial center. The downtown was a mix of old brick buildings and empty storefronts, but there was a gritty beauty to it. He found a parking spot near the waterfront and got out to stretch his legs. He walked along the river, watching the water flow past. He thought about the barges that had once carried coal and iron down this river, fueling the engines of industry. He thought about the immigrants who had come to work in the mills, building a new life in a new world. The old national road had brought them here, and the river had carried their products away. It was a network of movement, a web of connection. He saw a historic marker for the Wheeling Suspension Bridge, which had been the longest suspension bridge in the world when it was built in 1849. He walked to it, marveling at the iron cables and the stone towers. The bridge still carried traffic, a testament to the engineering of another era. He stood on the bridge and looked upriver, imagining the stagecoaches and wagons that had crossed here, the horses clattering on the wooden planks. He drove on, through the city streets, following the old road signs. He passed through Elm Grove, a neighborhood that had been a separate town in the early days. He saw a diner called the Roadhouse that looked like it had been there for decades. He was tempted to stop, but he had eaten breakfast recently. He filed it away for another trip. The road climbed out of the Wheeling Valley, winding up into the hills of Ohio. He crossed the state line and the landscape opened up. The farms were larger here, the fields rolling and golden. He passed through a town called St. Clairsville, which had a historic downtown with a courthouse square. He parked and walked around, looking at the old buildings. He saw a store that sold antiques, and he went in. The store was cluttered with furniture, glassware, and knickknacks. The owner was a woman named Doris, who was in her 70s. She had silver hair and kind eyes. She asked if she could help him, and he told her he was traveling the old national road. "Oh, honey," she said, her face lighting up. "I've lived on that road my whole life. My daddy used to run a gas station on Route 40 when I was a girl. I remember the cars pulling in, people from all over. It was a sight, I tell you." Harold asked her what she remembered most. "The people," she said. Travelers were different back then. They took their time. They'd come in and ask for directions, but they'd also ask about the town, about the people. They wanted to know where to eat, what to see. They weren't just passing through, they were experiencing. She showed him a photograph on the wall, black and white, of her father standing in front of the gas station. He was wearing a white shirt and a bow tie. The station was small and clean, with 2 pumps and a sign that said Daddy's Service. "That was the original," she said. "It's gone now. They tore it down to build a highway exit, but I still have the sign. It's in the back room." Harold bought a small glass paperweight, clear with a swirl of blue inside. It reminded him of the sky over the road. He thanked Doris and left. He drove on through the Ohio countryside. The road was straight in some places, curving in others. He passed through a town called Cambridge, which had a historic district with Victorian houses and a beautiful courthouse. He saw a sign for the National Road Bikeway, a trail for cyclists. He thought about how the road had been repurposed, adapted to new uses. It was no longer the main artery, but it still carried life. By midday, he was approaching Columbus. The suburbs began to appear, strip malls and housing developments. He decided to bypass the city, sticking to the old alignment that skirted the downtown. He followed Route 40 through towns like Reynoldsburg and Etna, which had been stagecoach stops. The road widened, became a four-lane divided highway in places, but there were still remnants of the old road, abandoned gas stations, faded motels, a diner with a neon sign that barely flickered. He stopped for lunch at a place called the Truck Stop Cafe in a town called West Jefferson. The cafe was full of truckers and locals, the air thick with the smell of fried food and coffee. He ordered a club sandwich and a slice of pie. The pie was apple with a flaky crust and a hint of cinnamon. He ate slowly, listening to the conversations around him. At the counter, two truckers were arguing about the best route to Chicago. One said he always took the interstate. The other said he preferred the old roads because they were more interesting. The second trucker was older, with gray hair and a weathered face. He said, "I've been driving for 40 years. I've seen the interstates grow up like concrete weeds, but the old roads, they're the ones that have soul. You don't see anything on the interstate. Just asphalt and trucks, but on the old road you see the country, you see the people." Harold smiled. He felt a kinship with that trucker. He finished his lunch and paid. He walked out into the afternoon sun, feeling full and content. He drove on through the flat farmlands of western Ohio. The road was straight and monotonous, but there was a peacefulness to it. He passed through towns with names like New Lebanon and Eaton. He saw a covered bridge in the distance and made a detour to see it. The bridge was old, built in the 1800s with a wooden truss and a red roof. He parked and walked inside, the boards creaking under his feet. The creek below was clear and shallow, and the light filtered through the gaps in the planks. He stood there for a few minutes, listening to the water and the birds. He drove on, and the afternoon turned into evening. The sun began to sink, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. He reached the Indiana border and crossed into a new state. The landscape was similar, but there was a subtle change. The fields seemed flatter, the towns smaller. He passed through a town called Richmond, which had a historic depot and a museum dedicated to the National Road. He decided to stop and see it. The museum was in a restored train station, and it was filled with artifacts from the road's heyday. There were old maps, photographs, and signs. There was a model of a stagecoach and a display about the construction of the road. He spent an hour there, reading about the crews of Irish immigrants who had built the road with picks and shovels, about the taverns and inns that lined the route, about the travelers who had come from all over the world. A volunteer docent, a retired schoolteacher named George, showed him around. George was passionate about the road, and he talked about it with the enthusiasm of a preacher. This road was the internet of its day, George said. It connected people. It brought news and goods and ideas. It changed America, and it's still here under our feet. You just have to know where to look. Harold asked him what the most interesting thing about the road was. "The stories," George said. "Every mile has 100 stories. There's the story of the boy who walked from Baltimore to St. Louis to find work. There's the story of the woman who ran a tavern and saved travelers from a blizzard. There's the story of the con man who sold fake maps to gullible tourists. This road is a library of human experience." Harold thanked him and bought a book about the road's history. He walked out into the evening, the sky now dark, the stars beginning to appear. He found a motel on the outskirts of town, a small place with a neon sign that said vacancy. He checked in and went to his room. He sat on the bed and opened the book. He read about the early days of the road, about the toll houses and the milestones, about the decline after the railroads came. He read about the revival in the 1900s, when the road was paved and became part of the U.S. highway system. He read about its slow fade into obscurity. The book was full of photographs, black and white images of cars and buses, of diners and motels, of people smiling at the camera. He closed the book and looked out the window. The parking lot was empty except for his car. The motel was quiet. He felt a sense of solitude, but it was not lonely. It was the solitude of the open road, the freedom of being untethered. He thought about the next day's journey. He would cross Indiana, then into Illinois, and then to St. Louis. He would see the gateway to the west, the arch that marked the beginning of the old trail. But he knew that the journey was not about the destination. It was about the moments along the way, the people he met, the stories he heard. He turned off the light and lay in the dark. The road was out there, waiting. He closed his eyes and listened. He could almost hear it, the whisper of tires on asphalt, the hum of the engine, the voices of all those who had traveled before him. He fell asleep to that sound, the ghost of the highway singing him into the night. He woke early, before the sun had fully risen. The room was cold, and he could see his breath in the pale light. He dressed quickly and packed his bag, the book from the museum tucked under his arm. He walked out to the car, the gravel crunching under his feet. The motel sign buzzed faintly, the neon flickering in the gray dawn. He started the engine and pulled out onto the empty road. The national road stretched ahead, a ribbon of asphalt glistening with dew. He drove west through the flat farmlands of Indiana. The fields were vast and quiet, the corn stalks standing like silent soldiers. He passed through towns that seemed to have been frozen in time. Centerville, where the brick storefronts still bore names from the 1-800s. Louisville, where a single gas station sold bait and cold soda. In each town, he saw the remnants of the old road, a milestone half buried in the grass, a faded sign pointing to a long-gone inn. He stopped for coffee at a small diner in the town of Knightstown. Diner was called the Traveler's Rest, and it looked as if it had been there since the road was new. The floor was checkered linoleum, the counter was chrome, and the stools were worn smooth by decades of use. A woman named Betty took his order. She was in her 70s, with gray hair tied back in a bun and a voice that carried the warmth of a wood stove. "You're out early," she said, pouring his coffee. "I'm following the old road," he said. She nodded, as if she understood. "You'll find pieces of it all along here." "My granddaddy used to tell me stories about the travelers. He worked at a blacksmith shop just a mile down the road. He said they'd come in with broken axles and tired horses. He'd fix them up and send them on their way. He knew everyone who passed through." Harold sipped his coffee. "What happened to the shop?" "It's gone," she said. "They put a subdivision in a few years back, but I still remember the sound of the hammer on the anvil. You don't forget that." He finished his coffee and thanked her. She gave him a small piece of pie wrapped in wax paper. "For the road," she said. He took it and walked out into the morning sun. The road continued, straight and unyielding. He passed through the town of Cambridge City, where a limestone arch still marked the entrance to an old park. He saw a sign for the Huddleston farmhouse, a preserved stagecoach stop from the 1-800s. He pulled into the gravel lot and walked around the property. The farmhouse was built of red brick, with a steep roof and thick walls. A plaque explained that travelers had once paid a few cents to sleep in the loft, sharing the space with sacks of grain and the smell of hay. He stood there for a long time, imagining the wagons and the horses, the voices in the dark. He drove on, crossing the White River. The bridge was old, made of iron and stone, and it rattled as he drove over it. On the other side, the road entered a stretch of woodland, the trees arching overhead like a cathedral. The sunlight dappled the asphalt, and the air was cool and damp. He rolled down the window and let the breeze wash over him. It smelled of earth and leaves, of something ancient and patient. By late morning, he was approaching Indianapolis. He decided to gamble and take the old alignment through the heart of the city. He knew it would be slower, but he wanted to see what remained. He followed Washington Street, which had been part of the National Road. It was a mix of old and new, brick buildings with iron balconies next to glass towers, a historic theater showing classic films across from a fast food chain. He saw a marker for the old National Road, a bronze plaque set into the sidewalk. He stopped and read it. This road was the first federally funded highway in the United States, authorized in 1-800s. He felt a strange pride, as if he were part of something larger. He continued through the city, the traffic thickening. He passed a diner called the Mile Marker, where the sign boasted, since 193. He thought about stopping, but the traffic was heavy and he pressed on. He crossed the White River again, this time in the shadow of the interstate, the sound of trucks rumbling overhead. West of the city, the road opened up again. The suburbs faded and the farmland returned. He passed through Plainfield, where a restored gas station had been turned into a museum. He didn't stop, but he slowed down to look at the old pumps, their glass faces glowing in the sun. He drove through Danville and then into the town of Rockville, where the courthouse square was lined with shops selling antiques and crafts. He decided to stop for lunch at a place called the Way Station. It was a modest building with a wooden porch and a sign that said home cooking. He ordered a bowl of chili and a cornbread muffin. The chili was hearty, with chunks of beef and beans, and the cornbread was sweet and buttery. He ate slowly, watching the other customers. There was a family with young children, a couple in their 60s, a man in a trucker hat eating alone. The man in the trucker hat caught his eye and nodded. "Where you headed?" the man asked. "St. Louis," Harold said, "taking the old road." "Yes," the man smiled. "Good for you. I did that run once, back in the 70s. It's a different world now, but the road's still there. You'll see things the interstate folks never will." Harold finished his lunch and paid. He stepped out into the afternoon, the sun high and warm. He walked around the square, looking at the old buildings. There was a hardware store with a sign from the 1-920s, a drugstore with a soda fountain still in operation. He bought a bottle of root beer and drank it while sitting on a bench. He watched the people go by, the slow rhythm of a small town on a Tuesday afternoon. He drove on into the late afternoon. The road curved through the river valleys, following the path of the old Indian trails that had become the national road. He crossed into Illinois, the state line marked by a faded sign. He passed through Marshall, where the courthouse had a statue of a soldier from the Civil War. He passed through Casey, where the old hotel still stood, its windows dark. As the sun began to set, he reached the town of Effingham. He found a motel on the outskirts, another small place with a neon sign. He checked in and went to his room. He opened the book and read more about the road's history. He read about the Great Migration West, the families who had loaded their belongings onto wagons and followed this road to new lives. He read about the advent of the automobile, the roadside attractions, the motels and cafes that had sprung up like wildflowers. And he read about the decline, the interstates diverting traffic, the towns.